The next topic is security, and my name is Tom Payne. I'm the IT Medical Director at University of Washington. This is an important topic for many reasons, but among those reasons is that it is specifically mentioned in the core content, and you can see on the outline that it falls in the central column in one line, actually, surprisingly small reference to it, but of course this core content is very broad in scope, and security is an element of it. If you were to expand that outline, you'd see that there are several subtopics called out in this area of security. The first is the Hipaa security rule and other government regulations. As we've mentioned earlier, those who are board certified should know that there is only one P in Hipaa and two A's. They specifically call out the security rule in this outline. They don't call out the privacy rule, although I recommend that you be familiar with both. The next topic is firewalls, which we will cover in some detail, then virtual private networks, and lastly encryption. So it's interesting to reflect on these last three bullets, which are elements of technical approaches to security. There isn't specific mention really to the policy and education side, but we will certainly cover those because they are important in our field. The key topics we'll cover today are the key elements of the Hipaa security rule. We will talk about policy and also technical measures to protect the security of identified patient health information. And because it's in the outline, we will cover the three technical measures listed there and others as well, and place them in a security context where they belong. They don't stand alone. They are part of a security context. So let's begin with some definitions. First, firewall. What is a firewall? Well, it is not simply a box. It is a set of hardware components, and those include routers, hosts, and combinations, and networks, and the software. And the design of this firewall is such that it restricts network traffic to conform to your organization's security policy. So it's a combination of hardware and software that includes the technical pieces mentioned, but the real goal is to conform to your security policy. The virtual private network is, as you might ascertain from the name, not a physical network. It is a virtual network. And the value of this is that it can take advantage of existing physical networks, but provide a secure communications mechanism over those networks. The most common use is over the internet, as I think most of you listening to this are aware. It provides a way to use the internet and even other networks securely, and it's now very easy to use VPN, and most of you have experience doing that. Well, that's the formal definition. Encryption is important to cover because in general it is probably not used to the degree that it should in our healthcare domain. HHS.gov is a good site to go for other detail on these topics. But you can see here that in that site they define encryption as a method of converting an original message, including text, into encoded text. Usually there's an algorithm behind this. It does not reduce the risk that someone who should not read the message cannot, but it reduces the risk so that it's very unlikely that that will happen. The goal is that it takes a great deal of effort to decrypt this without the key or the knowledge of the algorithm used. This can apply to almost any type of information in healthcare, and hopefully you're aware of the value of it and use it yourselves. There are a variety of algorithms and terms that could show up on the exam because these are attractive to those who write questions. First is DES, which stands for Data Encryption Standard, and there are a variety of variations on that term listed here. A hash is an algorithm that comes from the computer science domain, takes input from some source and converts it into something that is less comprehensible. In this case, a secure hash algorithm can be used for encryption, and you can see abbreviations there listed for a variety of commonly used secure hash techniques. Wi-Fi is ubiquitous these days, and signals transmitted over Wi-Fi can themselves be encrypted using a variety of algorithms, and you see several of them listed there: WEP, WPA, WPA2. Public key encryption is an interesting concept that shows up embedded in a variety of applications. It's a very simple concept, really. And here is the problem that it solves. If you encrypt a message with a key, and then you need the key to de-encrypt the message, you have another problem, which is how you get the key to the person you want to de-encrypt the message in a secure way. If you send it through unencrypted email, of course, then someone else may come across that key and be able to use it other than the intended recipient. So the challenge is, if you use a key that is private, then you have to somehow get it to the person who needs to use it to decrypt the message that you're sending. Public key encryption uses a different approach. In public key encryption, there is a public key posted that allows anyone to encrypt a message. Only you have the key to de-encrypt the message. So there's a difference in the key to encrypt and to de-encrypt. And this is very attractive because you can place the public key on your website. That can be used by anyone to send you a message, and when they do, only you have the key that is used to decrypt. So this is public key encryption. Now moving on to the Hipaa security rule, you can see that the details are listed there in the hhs.gov site. Briefly, it states that covered entities must do the following, and you can see the breadth here: ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic PHI, identify and protect against reasonably anticipated threats to security, protect against reasonably anticipated impermissible uses and disclosures, and lastly is a very important line: all of these things need to be brought to the attention and complied with by the workforce. It's not just the IT group, it's not just the CMIO, it's the workforce. So this has implications for your security program. It needs to include a great deal of outreach, education, review, and be an element of the orientation of employees, perhaps the annual review of their skills, and if you have a program to do this, security is an appropriate place for appropriate topic for that review. Now, security, just to review, security rule defines confidentiality to mean that it is not available or disclosed to unauthorized persons, and that it is available to those who need it. So it isn't sufficient to take the PHI, put it in a place that is very secure, and then to make it very, very difficult for anyone who needs it to gain access to it, because that wouldn't be consistent with the mission of your organization. It also has to be available and usable on demand by an authorized person. So burning down the building with all the hard drives in it is not a way to conform with the security rule. I don't think you have that in mind, but it points out that availability is an element as defined in the Hipaa security rule. Now, the ARRA changed Hipaa in the ways listed here, and these are important to know. As you know, Hipaa was also known as the Kennedy Bill in 1996, but it was revised as part of ARRA. It has requirements that are expanded to business associates. It has provisions listed there for limited data sets, restrictions and disclosures, marketing, charitable fundraising, and so on. It also has changes to enforcement, and these portions of Hipaa have considerable teeth to them now, including potential for criminal charges being placed and substantial fines. So it was strengthened, and it is broadened as a result of ARRA. So now we're going to have a first of the series of questions in this lecture, and here is the question. An encrypted laptop from your organization containing PHI on 250 research study subjects was misplaced at an airport. Which of the following is true? And you can see the choices there. Reporting immediately to the Secretary of HHS, not reporting it because the number was smaller than a threshold of 400, no report to the press or HHS, or individuals must be notified within 60 days. Which of those do you think is the choice? And I will tell you that the answer is C. This is an encrypted laptop. So the idea here is that if the information is not in a form that can be read by someone who should not read it, then a breach has not occurred. So this question is here to emphasize the importance of encryption. I hope that each of you have no PHI on any removable phone or device, hard drive, laptop that you have with you today. But if you do, if that information should be on an encrypted hard drive, and perhaps in an encrypted part of that encrypted hard drive, because if the laptop is stolen or misplaced, the hard drive could be removed, and if it's not encrypted, then password protection for the laptop may not be sufficient to protect that information. Okay, so let's move on to say that a breach did occur. Now, first of all, a definition of a breach. You can see listed here, it's the unauthorized acquisition, access, or use or disclosure of unsecured PHI, which compromises the privacy, security, integrity of the PHI. So what do we mean by unsecured PHI? Well, it really doesn't matter what you and I think. It matters what the Secretary of Health and Human Services thinks in this case. And the Secretary lists methods that meet this definition, and you can look them up. The importance of this is that if you secure the PHI, then you are protecting yourself against a breach. If a breach, on the other hand, occurs, if it isn't secured, then you must notify individuals within 60 days of discovery. And you have to resort to public media notification. And if the number of records disclosed exceeds 500, you must notify the secretary right away. But whether it exceeds that figure or not, you have to give the secretary an annual report of all breaches that have occurred. There is a website that shows all of these reports. It's jokingly referred to as the Wall of Shame, and I don't mean to make a joke out of it, it's serious, but this is publicly available. These are rules that you should be familiar with because they are great fodder for questions, the number of records, the number of days, and so on. We also have an obligation to have a security risk assessment, and this is also a change through ARRA. You can see the specific language here. It's a good idea to do this, to have an outside or an internal review of your security measures, but it is not only a good idea, it is required by law. You have to have security updates as necessary. This would allow you to correctly identify security deficiencies as part of your risk management processes. So, to summarize the security and privacy changes in the stimulus bill, which is ARRA, you can see that Hipaa and privacy and security rules now apply to business associates. Civil and criminal penalties also apply, and whether or not they are invoked is up to the U.S. Attorney and the Attorney General. Business associate agreements may need to be updated as a result of the stimulus bill, and you must pay careful attention to the contents of those agreements. This is something likely your legal team is involved with, but if you're not familiar with business associate agreements and what they are, it would be good to look at the hhs.gov website and review this. So now let's move on to technical measures, and I've listed 7 of them here. We'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. Audit Trails, encryption, VPN, we've talked about software discipline. Software discipline means that considerations to security are part of the entire life cycle of software development, not added on at the end. They are considerations in the initial design, the implementation, and discipline is exercised with a mind towards security. System assessment, we talked about the security requirement, the security system assessment. Another measure that is well worth your consideration and hopefully implementation is authentication of users, and hopefully strong or 2 or 3 factor authentication and firewalls. So let's move on to authentication. What do we mean by the word authentication? In this context, we mean it's the process of verifying the identity of a entity, which could be a person or a system, so that you are certain it is what you believe it to be. Someone is who they say they are, or the system is what you believe it to be. It's usually based on one of these 4 criteria. Something you have, which would, an example of this would be lock, a card, a token, maybe a cell phone, something that you know, and that would be a password, something related to who you are, which would be, an example of this would be a signature or your fingerprint, voice print, face print, something of that nature, and something indicating where you are located. And so this might mean a network address or something of that nature. So having more than one of these is a very good idea. Not just having a password, but having a token of some kind. And that's becoming more common with cell phones now. Fingerprint recognition adds a element of who you are. It's best to have that in combination with one of these others, as I mentioned before. So authentication is important because we first have to know who you are. Authorization, as we'll discuss, is now that we know who you are now authorized to do some things, but not all things. So that's the difference between authentication and authorization. Security requirements. These are general statements that are worth reflecting on because as you are facing questions, we don't want to omit some element of security requirements that might be important. So usually security is in layers, it's dynamic, it changes as your requirements change, it's comprehensive. It isn't sufficient to have a very strong lock to your house if you leave the windows open. It's commensurate with the asset classification and the value of your assets. It's cost effective. So you don't devote enormous resources to very low value information. On the other hand, if it is high value or contains PHI, you may go to exceptional measures to protect it, consistent with its value. It has to be consistent with your institutional mission and operations, so having a 65-character password that everyone has to memorize is not a good idea in healthcare, and it shouldn't take you 5 minutes to log in. There should be clear assigned responsibilities for security, and there should be metrics to measure how well you are achieving your objectives for security. A summary for this is defense in depth. There's no such thing as one size security that fits all. There will be differences between the security measures of organizations and elements within an organization. Some concepts to keep in mind. First, there is no perfectly secure information system. We have to understand what risks there are specific to an asset, which might mean a database or a computer system. And then we think about the threats to this system, and we design security controls to reduce risks so that the residual risks are at an acceptable level. If these threats become security incidents, this may lead to sanctions and modified security controls. We should acknowledge that security controls and ease of access often work against each other. Having no security may be easier for the user, but not acceptable practice. I'd like to mention a few things that are more recent. I don't know how likely it is that these will be on the exam, but certainly blockchain has been discussed for years, and it is very relevant to security. There is an article on this that I encourage you to look at, if only briefly, in JAMIA, the September 8th, 2017 issue. So the elements of blockchain in medical record management are listed here. The advantages are listed on the far left, that there is decentralized management, there's an immutable audit trail, data provenance, so you are able to be certain where the data originated, robustness and availability, and it has the potential to increase security and privacy. This is a relatively new technology within healthcare and not broadly applied, but it will be more common. It is showing up in the financial world a great deal these days, and like so many things in health IT, they often do start in the financial world and become adopted in healthcare later. So I would flip through this article or look elsewhere so that you're familiar with blockchain and why it is attractive to our security needs in healthcare. Now let's talk about controls and vulnerabilities in the context of security. there are several categories: the administrative, physical, and technical. They are all important. We don't want to overlook any one of these. Administrative security includes policies that you write, business associate agreements, contracts, and so on. Early in the days of health IT, acceptable internet use policies were new, and they're now widespread. We usually have policies about managing your passwords. Physical security is also important and sometimes overlooked when we discuss comprehensive security measures. It has to do with physical protection against entry into sensitive areas using badge readers, fingerprint readers, and so on. There is often a set of physical entry barriers to sensitive areas such as nurseries and to our data centers. We think of data centers, we may not think of physical security as being important in data closets, but that is also important. There have been breaches. One famously occurred in Boston, very tragically, where someone gained access to a data closet and was able to put a USB drive into some hardware there and intercept messages. And that's because the physical security to that data closet was insufficient. Let's spend a little more time on the technical security measures. There are some terms here that may not be familiar to you. First of all, firewalls now is familiar to you. But intrusion detection and prevention systems, IDPS, may not be familiar to you. These permit the team to be aware of attempts to penetrate secure systems and networks. Network access control is a way to control who has access to a network, which may be wireless, it may be physical. VPNs we've talked about. Data leakage protection. That is maybe a new term to you. What do we mean by data leakage? Well, I'll give you an example. If someone walks into a data center, takes a picture of a screen with PHI on it, puts the cell phone with the picture in it in their pocket and leaves the data center, then data has leaked out. That is an example of data leakage. It goes from someplace it should be to someplace it should not be. Systems and applications are places where technical controls are more commonly known. We've talked about authentication and authorization, audit logs. One very important and overlooked technical control is patching. And in the news these last few years have been examples of breaches that occurred when operating systems were not patched appropriately, and perpetrators took advantage of this and gained access to systems that should have been secure. Host-based firewalls are firewalls that are on the host that is to be protected. We've already talked about IDPS, the intrusion detection prevention systems, and then I list encryption 3 times because that is a technical control that is not likely not adequately used within healthcare. There's a great book on measures called For the Record from the Institute of Medicine, and they list technical practices and procedures that you see shown here. I'll highlight a few of these. Audit Trails are a very useful tool to make sure that there aren't suspicious patterns of access. One very reasonable approach is to show patients audit trails of their own data. It is harder than it may seem because so many legitimate users need to access their EMR record, for example, many health professionals are involved in their care, and that may not be apparent to them. They may be asleep at night and not know all the people there, but having them have access to the audit trail of their record has potentially a great deal of value to making sure there aren't inappropriate accesses. Database recovery, that's an important point to make. That it's a great thing to have backups of important systems. It's even better if you can recover the data when you need to. Physical security means you have locks and barriers to people entering the data center or gaining access to a sensitive workstation with sensitive information. Protection of remote access points is important. That would be a port on a system. It used to be dial-up modems, but now it's more likely a port through which a perpetrator might gain access otherwise. We talked about software discipline and system assessment before. Operational practices include those listed here. We've talked about security and confidentiality policies, committees, information security officers, someone whose responsibility it is to assure that there's a comprehensive program for security. Sanctions, what are those sanctions? Are people aware of them? Authorization forms, and I mentioned patient access to audit logs. Now, here is another quiz for you. Which of the following is usually not part of an organizational security program? I'll let you read the options. And the answer to this question is C. Corporate integrity agreements. You may not be familiar with these. Hopefully you are not. They impose specific structural and reporting requirements to promote compliance with federal health care program standards at entities that have resolved fraud allegations. So this is an agreement that you may not need to have in place. Hopefully you will not. So that is the answer. And it's not part of a typical organizational security program. So let's talk about security layers in a little bit more detail, introducing some terms that you may have familiarity with or may need a refresher on. We've talked about physical security, which includes intrusion, fire, power, seismic protection. We've talked about network, wired equivalents, privacy, firewalls. Phishing, malware, and spoofing we'll go through in more detail. We talked about the importance of software design, updates, and authentication, and we talked about the importance both of backup and the ability to restore and having redundancy to key sources of information. So, security definitions. Malware. What is malware? It's a contraction of malicious software. So a very broad definition, but you hear it quite commonly. There are lots of different varieties of malware. A spoofing attack is when one person or program successfully masquerades as another person or program by falsifying data, thereby gaining illegitimate advantage. So you're pretending that you are someone who you are not. And the person who was fooled by this may disclose information to you. A very common way to do this uses a social approach is phishing. This is related to spoofing, but not the same. Spoofing might mean that you change an IP address or you change an email address. Phishing is a deception perpetrated by email where recipients are enticed into following an attacker's instructions, and the goal is often to steal credentials. There's spear phishing, a variant on this, and spear phishing is targeting this very specifically to, for example, people with a boss who is simulated as the source of the phishing attempt. So everyone who gets this email has that person as their boss and may be inclined to do what the email says, thinking it is from their boss when it is not. Denial of service. This is an attempt to prevent legitimate users from accessing information or services, and this is often done by overwhelming the system so that the system is still up and running, but there are so many requests for service from it that legitimate users do not have access. This may take a fair amount of effort to achieve, so often the effort is distributed among many, many different systems across the world, and that is a distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS. Ransomware is a type of malware that infects computer systems, restricting users' access to the infected systems, usually by encryption. And users are told that unless they pay a ransom, then access will not be restored. These definitions and more are available at us-cert.gov, which is a great site to go for information in this general area. Another quiz. Spoofing is best prevented by which of the following? And the answer is B, workforce education. It's an example of where education plays a very important role in that firewalls and encryption are not the issue here. This is someone willingly giving up information in unencrypted form, thinking that is going to a destination when in fact it's going to a different destination. So education is our best defense in this case. Risk assessment. We talked about that briefly. How can this be done? Risk assessment can be done either by asking the asset owners to do a self-assessment. You could be an assessment by an internal group separate from the asset owners, someone within security or risk management, internal audit. That's not commonly the case. Or it may be performed by an external group. And there are firms that will probe and usually are bonded so that if they are successful, then they're not held legally responsible because they've been asked to do this. These are so-called white hat hackers working on your behalf. External auditors may do this, and there are electronic forms of probing your system. There are the vulnerability scanners. Usually this assessment includes measurement, a qualitative measure, high, medium, or low risk, or a quantitative, which has a numeric score. What do we do with the results of this? If we identify risks, we can either accept them and say there's really nothing we can do. We have to live with that risk. We can mitigate it. We can put in a new security measure that reduces the risk. And finally, we may elect to transfer the risk somewhere else. When we say risk transference, it usually means insurance, so that your damage from a breach or a security threat is compensated by someone with whom you have an insurance policy. So that's a way to transfer risk from your organization to another one. Usually that's not for free. Security incident handling. Here are some examples. If you're in an academic center or someplace where there are trainees, you may face a DMCA violation, and I'll tell you what that means later, but I'll tell you now also. Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which would mean that copyrighted material may, for example, a video may be stored on one of your systems without your knowledge. That's an example of an incident. VVIP access, a very important person is in your system and somebody looks at his or her record. there may be unencrypted PHI on a desktop or a laptop, or there may be a disclosure of information that is used for identity theft. These are examples of security incidents. There is a breach notification process, hopefully in place. The organization that enforces violations to Hipaa is the Office of Civil Rights, OCR. So there may be audits in advance or after the fact. These include risk management, portfolio, awareness education, and usually there is senior management support because these are very serious. Let me mention one other topic that is very pertinent to this topic these days, and that's bring your own device. The idea here is that many times devices that an individual or worker owns are used in the workplace to carry out that person's role. This has advantages, it has disadvantages. Some of the disadvantages can be mitigated by having policies in place, and those policies should address the personally owned mobile devices within the organization. The questions you should be thinking about include whether or not they should be able to connect to the organization's internal network with their personally owned devices, either remotely or on site, and what happens if that device is lost, whether it's encrypted, whether it has been scanned for viruses, and so on. Here is a long list of abbreviations that you should be familiar with, because these are great fodder for questions again. Sarbanes-Oxley Act. You can see the common rule we've talked about and we'll review again. Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998 we've discussed briefly, and the Joint Commission and Hipaa. There are some great sources of information beyond those I've mentioned in the slides. The For the Record book I mentioned from the National Academy Press is online. A chapter in our textbook covers security and infrastructure, might be worth reviewing, and there are many provided in the reference list. So we'll stop there.